0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And do watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. After being caught on camera complaining about coverage of the crumbling concrete schools row, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, has been forced to apologise. A recording made by ITV shows her swearing after complaining she wasn't getting credit for doing a good job. The political journalist and author, Michael Crick, has been telling LBC he questions the release of the footage.
I wouldn't have used it, and I think it was wrong of ITV to do so. I could have been a more successful journalist if I'd used some of the comments that people made off camera, either before or after an interview. But on the other hand, people wouldn't have been doing interviews with me for much longer. They would have said, not talking to Crick again, I can't trust him.
A former Justice Secretary has told LBC there must be an urgent examination into domestic abuse laws. Campaigners are calling for perpetrators whose victims take their own life to be charged with more serious offences like manslaughter. And Spain's 4 men's captains have condemned what they've called unacceptable behaviour by the country's FA president, Luis Rubiales, at the Women's World Cup final. He's been suspended by FIFA for kissing the player Jenny Hermoso, which she says wasn't consensual after they won the trophy for the first time. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 11 points at 74.52. The pound buys $1.26 and €1.16. LBC weather, dry and clear tonight with a few showers in the far southwest, cloudy with a few spots of rain in the far north of Scotland, and a low of 8 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and very good evening. It's 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's edition of Cross Question. Joining me on the panel this evening, to my left, Anne McElvoy, broadcaster and executive editor of Politico Europe. We'll find out more about that in a moment. Next to her is Paul Nowak, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress. An old hand at this by now, aren't you?
I've done it at least once, yeah.
To my right, Richard Holden is Conservative Roads Minister and MP for North West Durham. And sitting next to me to my right, Steve Reid, Labour's new Shadow Environment Secretary and MP for Croydon North. We'll find out what it's like to be reshuffled. Lots of subjects that you might want to phone in about. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And watch us, Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first caller. It's John in Sherborne in Dorset. Hello, John.
Good evening, Ian.
Hi, what would you like to say?
Well, my question to the panel is this. If broadcast media, any media outlet, if they're going to go for gotcha journalism, they create an area of a lack of trust, and in which case the only information we may expect is carefully sanitized, drafted press releases. And if that's the case, what happens to democracy?
Anne McElvoy, you are, apart from me, the only broadcaster on the panel. I'm really interested to hear your views on this, because we spent the last hour on the programme talking about this, and most of the callers do not take the view that John puts forward. Most of the callers say it was outrageous for Gillian Keegan to say what she did, and it's quite right for ITV to broadcast it. What's your view?
I think so. I think if you could broadcast Gordon Brown, the infamous bigoted woman, comments, top-flight professional politicians have to be aware if they're near a microphone, they're still mic'd, that there is a danger, and it does sit kind of oddly with her role. So I think it's fair to broadcast it. People can come up with a lot of people I think maybe even disagree on the panel about whether it's okay to sort of let fly with the F word in those circumstances. I have to say a lot of politicians will quietly agree with it. It's like, you know what I have to put up with, all this lands in my inbox, a lot of problems that have been there for many years. You have to deal with them. Give me a bit of a break. I think some people will identify with that, but I think it's actually okay if you walk straight out of an interview you say something like that, you are running a bit of a risk.
You are running a risk, but I mean, I hope my memory is serving me correctly here. I think I criticised Sky at the time for broadcasting the Gordon Brown, Gillian Duffy comments.
But can I just come back then and say,
Yeah,
do you think that when a politician, they come all nice as pie and they're totally controlled and often boring as anything? I wasn't
looking over that side of the table.
I was not going to do a Gillian Keegan on my first appearance on this show. And then they do something or say something is completely counter to that, and you think, we won't share that with the public. Why?
Because the interview's finished. And therefore, surely ethically, I can remember many incidents on this programme where in the commercial break, we all have a little discussion about something. Somebody says something slightly off colour. And I could ruin their political careers by broadcasting that. I wouldn't even dream of doing it.
But I think for a minister, this is where I come back to, and you're right, it's a matter of judgment, and everyone's probably said something close to a microphone they shouldn't have said close to a microphone. But it is that contrast, and you are, I think, bringing it home to your audience that this person feels very strongly that she's not being fairly treated. I mean, if she just started talking about something completely off topic and swore, then I would say you probably shouldn't broadcast that. But it was on topic. It did show us what she really thinks, and it was clearly unwise of her to speak like that close to a microphone. Similarly with Gordon Brown, we got to know what he really thought, and I think it's justified.
OK. Richard Holden, have you ever been in this position?
Well, I mean, given you've probably recorded all of the ad breaks you've done before now, Ian, I'm really worried. I think, look, if there's a live camera there, it does a bit go with the territory if you are a politician. I think you've got to be a bit careful of that. I mean, sometimes in my constituency surgeries, actually the way that, you respond to people on a one-on-one basis and the way that they would speak to you. And sometimes that would be more blunt than you want broadcast. But I think that's a slightly different scenario than when you're doing national broadcast TV. But, I think it goes to the territory. She has apologised for, and I think it is for the swearing element of it, which I think is fair enough.
Given that Number 10 were fully behind Lee Anderson when he used a similar word in an on-the-record interview a few weeks ago, they lost no time in throwing her under the bus today. Why would they do that?
No, I think the Education Secretary decided that she didn't want those words to be what was leading the bulletins as much as they have been. So she's wanted to go out and clarify that, and it's not the way that Gillian would normally address an audience. The way that Lee might address an audience is quite different, and I think it does reflect the sort of politician that they are as to how they'd like to present themselves, which I think is fair enough as well.
Was she right to apologise?
Yeah, I mean, she has done it. It's her choice. I don't really want to start casting.
Because Number 10 said she was wrong before she apologised. I mean, that's where there's an inconsistency there.
No, I understand that. I think the key thing here was that they want she, as the Education Secretary, quite rightly wants the focus to be on what they're doing now. She doesn't want to be on the words she used. She wants to be on the fact that the government are trying to get a grip of this situation, which has really emerged since the surveys started going out in March, and she wants to show that progress, and that's what she wants to be the focus of what she's talking about today.
Steve Reed.
Well, I mean, it may not appear like it, but we do get some modicum of training to do this job sometimes. And one of the things they tell you when you get a job where you're going to be... and not very much, and I'm sure it comes across, but one of the things they say to you is, look, when the mic's on, be careful what you say because it might get broadcast. So, you're aware of what might happen. And for my part, I think a little bit of colourful language sometimes can humanise a politician. We can come across as a bit like automatons sometimes if we're just doing the lines. So I don't think that is the problem. I think the issue here isn't how she said what she said. It was the attitude underneath it, which was a bit arrogant, I thought. Why are people not giving me credit when actually she's presiding over a pretty terrible fiasco where kids are being unable to go to school with just a few days' notice because the government, of which she is a part, had failed to act on multiple warnings about this. But
her point was that the government couldn't act if the head teachers and the local education authorities or the academies hadn't sent back the information which they were asked to provide some time ago.
Do you know what? I'd like to think if we were in government, we might be a little bit more proactive than just emailing out a form and then sitting back and thinking, job done.
They had been chased.
Which is what they've done. You know, what you would do is, there's an issue with the structure of school buildings. You'd get a proper condition survey done. You wouldn't just email out a form, and then you would collate it.
That's not the responsibility of government. That's the responsibility of each individual school or local education.
The DfE has a responsibility to oversee the safety of all of our schools. In fact, one of the reasons we're calling for an audit of all public sector buildings is because we need to know the scale of the problem with general maintenance, particularly this kind of. Well, that's what the government's responsible for, so that you can see the scale of the problem, so you can see the kind of investment that might be needed to tackle it. You can't just have a government that is hands off and then stands back when there's a problem and says, "Not my fault, Gov." Particularly when it was this government that cancelled the planned maintenance programme, Building Schools for the Future, that would have meant that this kind of concrete had been taken out years ago.
Paul Nowak.
Yeah, well, I think she chose the wrong target for her frustration. I mean, I think rather than taking her frustration out on school leaders and local authority leaders, she should be taking her frustration out on her cabinet colleagues, on the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. In particular, as Steve said, this is a government that oversaw the cancellation of the Building for Schools for the Future programme. Rishi Sunak in 2020, 2021 cut in half the programme available to support the rebuilding and repair of schools. Now, I mean, I think it's interesting. Richard says there's a double standard almost for the deputy leader of the Conservative Party can F and Jeff, the Education Secretary can't. But for me, actually, the real issue is who's dealing with this crisis in our schools that are literally crumbling down around our kids and our teachers. That's the real issue, I think.
Well, the Prime Minister denies that he's cut funding for school buildings. He says that over the next 10 years, 500 million for 50 schools a year to be either rebuilt or completely new schools, which is roughly what it's been on average over the past 10 or 20 years.
Over the past 10 years, the DfE were very clear that they needed funding to repair or replace 300 schools, not 50 schools. So I think the Prime Minister, he does have to take responsibility. And I think, Iain, I would just say this, I think this is partly, it reflects a Prime Minister and a Cabinet that doesn't see the day-to-day decline of our public services because they don't use those public services themselves. Rishi Sunak does not send his kids to state schools.
Well, he doesn't
use our NHS. He doesn't use our railways. He flies by helicopter. So anybody who goes into any of our schools...
He did use the train the other day and had to get off because it was 2 hours late.
Well, that's the privatised, fragmented railway system for you. There's a serious point here that you can't think of any aspect of our public realm or public services that has got better.
That is a fair accusation, Richard Holden, isn't it?
No, I actually just, I get why Paul and Steve are saying what they're saying, but, I mean, you just need to actually look at what the government's done on this programme around schools. There's big surveys went out in March this year. 90% of schools have got back, tens of thousands of them across the country. But what didn't happen was that happened in Wales, where Labour have been in government for 25 years. Now, if you want, it's fair enough to throw criticism around if you want to on that basis, but in answer to that, Labour have been in government in Wales. Why didn't they even
That's such a nonsense, because in Wales they didn't cancel Building Schools for the Future.
But
you did it in England. So they've had planned maintenance for 13 years.
So
it's
is that
scrapped.
No, but is that...
That's why the problem's happening here.
There's two issues here. You are aware that 2 schools in Wales have closed today, aren't you?
But the problem is much worse here because the UK got a Nick Gibb, who's still an education minister.
You don't even know it's
Building Schools for the Future.
You can't say that, Steve, because
Schools for the Future.
Well, I'll come on to Building Schools.
And didn't replace it with anything else.
No, that's not true. I'll come on to Building Schools for the Future in a second. But you can't say it's worse in England because we have no idea how bad it is in Wales. We have absolutely no idea because the Welsh Labour government have been in power for almost 25 years. They've not even started to look at this in the Welsh school sector at all.
I know from running a council and, the condition of council housing.
How many are in Wales then?
Like if you carry out planned maintenance,
one at a time, because people can't hear.
If you carry out planned maintenance over an extended period of time, it costs you far less than waiting for a crisis to happen and then having to intervene. So you're wasting public money as well as putting people's lives in danger. And it shouldn't be accepted. And you knew it was going on. A school collapsed in Kent in 2018 and the government did nothing.
You can't even say what Labour are doing in Wales at the moment. 2 schools, literally, after the schools have opened, have been closed. At least the government in England has been ahead of the game.
Do you think the government should publish?
Okay. But let's move on. Final word on this to Anne McElvoy, because it is true that Labour have been warning about this for some time. Bridget Phillipson, the Shadow Education Secretary, has asked questions in Parliament about it. So it shouldn't come as a huge surprise to everyone, should it?
Yes, it's just come with a rush and a push, hasn't it? It's come at a time when the government already is on the back foot on its record on public services. Clearly, mistakes were made, and they do also go back to whoever's been in power. I mean, this was, it was a way of building cheaply. It's a lot of the problems that we have in infrastructure, that we do things very cheaply. We do the same with house building. You have so many problems to do with houses that were built. And this is, at a time when building technology has actually moved on, and we should be able to do better. There is an investment problem in schools. It goes way beyond, I think, back before the present government, but it is also fair enough, and I have to say to Richard, he represents the area where I grew up. I grew up northwest Durham. I would have been a constituent. My parents were constituents. And when I saw that list today, and I saw a school on the list in Ferry Hill, for instance, school I actually know well, and you think, look, really, your job is also to defend parts of the country where they need their schools to be invested in. We have so many really bad holes in our education, the buildings and in what goes on in the schools. So I understand it seems to be the new Conservative line to take that it's all very bad in Wales too, but that's not good enough. And you must feel, and I think if we were talking, let's say the mics were off, I think you would say, I actually feel for my constituents, and I'm worried about them.
I would absolutely say that. Ferry Hill isn't in my constituency, is it?
I know, sorry, it's over the border.
But I would also say that the idea that the Labour Party have got this all right where they are in government is also not true.
I've raised 150
I also agree with that.
I would say that's a bit disingenuous.
But I didn't say that.
Quick
Can I just make one final serious point in that this has also exposed the crisis that we got around asbestos in our schools, and our teaching unions have been warning about this for years. The majority of people now who die from asbestos-related injuries and disease are not people working in manufacturing or steel or traditional industries. It's public servants and teachers and women teachers, and so we've got to sort out asbestos in schools as well.
Right, we're about to switch the microphones off. We'll be saying all sorts of things over the next 3 minutes, but
really
they will,
exciting.
of course, all will be reported afterwards. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
19 minutes past 8. Corey was very naughty in that break, and he said I should ask all the panel what's their favourite swear word, but none of them would play along, which I thought was a great shame, but there we go. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. If you've just tuned in, we have Richard Holden, the Conservative Roads Minister, with us, and McElvoy, broadcaster and executive editor of Politico Europe. Now, that's a very grand job title.
Oh, it's very long.
What does an executive editor actually do?
Executively edit. But basically, I've joined in about the last eight months to build.
You were with The Economist for a long time.
I was with The Economist for a very long time, 12 years. And I built a big kind of podcasting thing there, and I've joined Politico because Politico Europe and Politico US are now under one great umbrella, one huge happy family. It seems to encompass most of the Western world. And I am leading podcasting, particularly in that European space, but also launching my own show.
Oh, are you?
Power Play. In about 2 weeks' time, terrifyingly, and it is going to be interviews, transatlantic interviews. So one week it could be an American guest, or another week a European, or indeed, let's see what the launch guest is, and we might let you know who the launch guest is.
So I do listen to the Westminster Insider podcast with Alvaro and Jack Blanchard. I think that's excellent.
Mm-hmm. It's class, isn't it?
But I'm sure you do lots of others too.
And we are certainly going to expand to do lots of other stuff.
Everyone's into
that is
podcasting
my
nowadays, aren't they?
Editor-ness and preparing this new
Paul
show.
Nowak is here as well, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, and Steve Reed, who is Labour's new Shadow Environment Secretary. And we have a question on the Labour reshuffle from David in Uxbridge. Hello, David.
Yeah, hi, thank you. Yeah, it's just, do you think now it's the sort of latest sign that Labour's banned traditional Labour values, vis-a-vis, tackling wealth inequality, and they never talk about, redistribution. So do you think it's another sign, and do they think it'll work?
Because if you look at quite a lot of the appointments, it seems to be the rise of the Blairites and the decline of, shall we say, the centre-left a little bit. Is that a fair comment, Steve Reed?
Oh, what does Blairite even mean? 30 years on from, when Blair became leader, I think it's meaningless to use labels like that. And what Keir was trying to do is assemble the best possible team to carry Labour's message to the British people as we approach the next general election. Now, he's been very clear with all of us. He wants us to focus on how our policies in each of our areas and collectively can help improve the lives of the British people who feel that the country just doesn't work for them anymore, people who feel that their futures have been taken away from them. We need to show how we are the party of aspiration, of hard work, of law and order, the things that matter to the British people. At his conference last year, Keir described Labour as being at our best when we are the political wing of the British people, and that's what we need to do. And I'm really proud to be part of Keir's shadow cabinet, and I'm really excited with some of the new people that have come through and will be my colleagues now. There's new people like Darren Jones, who's done a great job as a select committee chair for science and business, won plaudits from all sides. And then from Darren, there's a figure like Hilary Benn, who's got huge experience in government, coming in to take on the Northern Ireland brief. So I think it's quite a mixed and diverse team, but we've got one big focus, and that is to show the British people how we're going to do our best to give them their futures back.
How does it feel to be demoted, though?
Well, I don't know. I haven't been.
Well, you have?
No. Why would you say that? I think the environment brief is absolutely fantastic brief.
In the rankings of the Cabinet or Shadow Cabinet, as well as I do, and I'm sure will back me up on this.
Oh, well, right, okay. The big mansplain.
The DEFRA job is a lower rank than Justice.
No, I absolutely refute that. Completely refute that.
Am I right, Anne?
No, there was a huge... In whose eyes? Who on earth would see it like that? Who on earth would see it like that?
Everyone apart from someone called Steve Reed.
If you look at the issues, look at prices in the shops, the broken down food supply chains that are making people pay more for food than they need to pay. If you look at what's going on with our rivers and the sewage that has been polluting our rivers and lapping up on the beaches, if you look at the terrible deal that the government got for farmers when they opened up the borders to much cheaper and lower quality meat from Australia.
You're going to go back on that then?
Even a government minister, George Eustace, denounced that himself as a failure.
So I think you've just given us an example of
I'm pointing out what they've done wrong and why these things matter. These are all part of what affects British people's day-to-day lives.
How many farms are there in your constituency?
It's not just about farmers. I'm not here to represent a particular section of industry.
Everyone in my constituency goes and buys food in the supermarket. Grant chaps for having no experience of defence What experience of rural life have you got?
Well, the things I just talked about, pollution in our waterways and our rivers, the prices of food in the shops, these affect absolutely everybody. You know, all of us have the right to go out and enjoy nature and don't wish it to see it degraded. I spent my summer holiday, I like going camping, so I went camping down on the south coast. I'm afraid I do. Yeah. So I was down in Sussex and Dorset camping just in the summer. But, you know, we're so lucky to be blessed with this kind of nature and environment.
So can I tell you whether I think Steve's more or less important than he was about? Yeah. So I think that's a good example. I mean, it's a really big, meaty kind of brief, so to speak, you know, British beefy mix that you've got in the classic way of looking at cabinet pecking order. It is less than justice, but I go a bit with what Steve said. I think it's incredibly important. These are things I think I would be careful about being hasty about what you want to overturn of Tory policy there, because I think it's going to look very different if Labour come into power, how much they're actually able to do on a number of these issues, including the pollution of the waters, where I absolutely agree with you. I think it's one of the really a national crisis in many parts of the country. So also you could say, like justice, a lot of people didn't really want justice when it came along. They always wanted to be Home Secretary. So they're more fungible, they're a bit more changeable, these pecking orders, than you might be. I'm not going to suggest you're at all like stuck in the past or anything, but you know.
Well, many people do, because they're probably right.
I think it's fine. I think it's
like cabinet table top trumps.
I'd take it.
Yeah. Well, listen. First of all, I would never comment on the changes that Keir makes to his senior leadership team. I wouldn't want him to comment on the TUC's general counsel and the makeup of our senior leadership team. But I don't recognise the description of somehow this reshuffle representing a shift away from Labour's traditional values. I mean, so take the issues that really matter to our members. Labour's commitment to deliver a new deal for working people, and an employment bill within the first 100 days of a Labour government, a ban on fire.
Who does that come under now? Because that was Angela Rayner.
And it's still with Angela. And Angela will come to our Congress on Tuesday next week and talk about Labour's commitment to deliver that legislation in the first 100 days of a Labour government. I think that's a very clear commitment and one that will hold Labour to. It's a really important commitment, and it's a popular commitment at the ballot box as well. I mean, a majority of Conservative voters want to see something like fire and rehire outlawed, so we don't have the spectacle of a P&O where 800 people are sacked without notice, without consultation. Does that mean that we agree with Labour on everything? No. I mean, I think the caller talked about wealth and redistribution. I've called very openly for us to have a national conversation about tax, how we tax wealth, not work, because I think there is something fundamentally broken in our taxation system in this country. But I don't think that shadow cabinet reshuffle in any way represents a shift away from Labour's traditional values. Far from it.
Angela Rayner's the big winner, isn't she, in this?
Well, I think she's got a really important department in the Levelling Up department, and as I say, she's going to be taking forward that new deal for workers, which I think is really important. And Angela, I think, is someone that's popular with voters. She's popular within the party. She's popular with unions, partly because she's one of us. She came up through the trade union movement, was educated in the trade union movement. I think she would say herself turned their life round because of the trade union movement. And I think having her in such an important role is really important.
Richard Holden, that's going to be quite a spectacle, isn't it? Angela Rayner versus Michael Gove over the dispatch box.
Well, I mean, Angela always goes into these meetings with Keir Starmer and comes out with a better job than the one she went in with, despite his best efforts otherwise. And, you know, she's got that deputy... Well, indeed, a deputy... I mean, I don't know what it says about Keir's negotiation skills, particularly when it comes to Angela. And I quite like Angela, actually. I listened to a podcast she did with Matt Ford the other day. I thought there is a human side to her, but, you know, maybe it says a little bit more about Keir. I mean, it does feel a bit, though, you know, that all of those... I saw John McTernan had tweeted earlier on about all the Blairites coming back up through, and maybe it is a bit of a New Labour tribute act with the hand of Peter Mandelson maybe behind some of these changes. I mean, the one what did surprise me was Shabana Mahmood's move to justice, because I thought, given the way that she'd campaigned, you know, quite vociferously to have some of those people who've been convicted of quite serious crimes to not be deported, I thought that was an odd move, you know. But you know, I mean, I've got nothing against Steve at all, you know. I mean, he's more than welcome to come up to North West Durham, and I'm sure he will be, and chat to some of the farmers. I don't know how many he's got in Croydon North, but you know, it'd be welcome to see some of the, you know.
Why didn't Rishi Sunak do a big reshuffle? I mean, was it because he's just politically weak and he's not in a position to do one?
I think it's already been outlined that he's he's, the number 10 have been briefing out that they're going to do that as part of a broader series of things later in the year. But Ben Wallace had made it very clear that he wanted to leave and leave quite quickly, and that's fair enough. But and we'll see what Rishi comes up with further down the line.
OK, we'll take more of your calls and questions in just a moment. Keep them coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30 on LBC. Let's get the latest news headlines with Tim Daly.
After being caught on camera complaining about coverage of the crumbling concrete schools row, the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, has been forced to apologise. A recording made by ITV shows her swearing after complaining she wasn't getting credit for doing a good job. The former Cabinet Minister, Sir Gavin Williamson, has apologised for bullying a colleague after he wasn't invited to the late Queen's funeral. Parliament's watchdog says his behaviour towards Wendy Morton was offensive and intimidating. And a former Justice Secretary has told LBC there must be an urgent examination into domestic abuse laws. Campaigners are calling for perpetrators whose victims take their own lives to be charged with more serious offences. LBC weather, dry and clear tonight with a few showers in the far southwest, cloudy with a few spots of rain in the far north of Scotland and a low of 8 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:33 on LBC. We have Steve Reed, Richard Holden, Anne McElvoy and Paul Nowak with us answering your questions. Let's go to a text question from Soph in Edinburgh. Labour's shadow mental health minister has quit her role and said Keir Starmer doesn't take the issue seriously enough. Do our political leaders still not take mental health seriously enough? Now, the background to this is that Rosina Allen-Khan wrote to Keir Starmer in her resignation letter that he made clear that he does not see a space for a mental health portfolio in a Labour cabinet, which is why she told him many weeks ago that she would not be able to continue in this role. Now, there's never been a Secretary of State for Mental Health, it has to be said, under governments of any particular colour. Paul Nowak, what are we meant to make of this?
Well, I don't think you assess whether or not you're taking mental health seriously necessarily by whether or not you've got a shadow cabinet or a cabinet position. I think actually politicians across the spectrum have to take mental health seriously because it's something that matters greatly to the public. It certainly matters to our members, and you see it reflected in our day-to-day work. I mean, when I was a trade union activist 30-odd years ago going on training courses, no one talked about mental health. Health and safety was physical risks. It was manual handling. Now the big issue when you go into lots of workplaces is mental health, is burnout, is stress. It's part of that great resignation why lots of people haven't come back into the labour market after the pandemic. And I have to say, I mean, just 3 months ago I was up in Blackpool at a mental health hospital and seeing the work that those staff did and the environments in which they were working. I mean, these were people, the service is at, close to breaking points every single day, and the demand for those services continues to rise, and their ability to cope with those demands doesn't get any greater. So I think any politician, any party needs to take mental health seriously, and as I say, for me, it matters just as much as asbestos or physical risks in a workplace. I want people to go to work and come back safe and healthy, and that includes mental health as well.
Richard?
No, look, mental health is incredibly important. I was a constituency MP. I remember one of the most difficult cases I ever had to deal with was two parents who came to see me whose daughter was very severely anorexic, and trying to get her the care that she needed. She, in fairness, down the line, she did get it eventually, after really, but it was a real struggle, and she's gone on and she's now training to be a nurse herself. So, a lovely success story, but that doesn't happen for everybody. My dad was ill for a very, very long time with severe mental health problems, and people do need real support there. I don't want to kick the hell out of the opposition on this one. I think, you've got to have the broader roles. Health is mental and physical as well. But it's right that I think across the board, actually, as a country, we're starting to see the impact it has on that parity of esteem, which everybody always talks about. And it does feel that we're getting there in a way that perhaps we weren't, 15, 20, 30 years ago, as Paul says. I think it's very important. And the one thing I would say is I was disappointed on that Keir didn't do the veterans thing like we've got with Johnny Mercer, because I think some of those issues, are very prevalent, particularly in veterans community. And I think, especially in light of, what so many people went through, whether it's in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, I think that it's been very important. And also the fact that they often are at the real extremes of those things, some things around homelessness or mental health issues, that has a real concentration on as well. And Johnny does a really good job on that, and he's a good friend of mine, and he's a real advocate and champion for the forces.
And this issue has really come to the fore, I think, over the last 10 years. But do you think Rosina Allen-Khan, who is a medical professional herself, a doctor, she still practices as a doctor in a local hospital, do you think maybe she might have been better advised to sort of think, well, actually, Minister of State job on mental health, that's not to be sniffed at, and I've got several years' experience in this role. It seems a little bit gratuitous.
Yeah, look, I can understand that she feels disappointed, but I have to say I think it was a bit of a gimmick in the first place. I don't think they were ever going to go into the next election. Cabinet seats are incredibly hard fought and sort of precious, and by which I am, of course, not saying that mental health. I agree with what both people on the panel have said. Absolutely right. Raise the profile, be more serious. It crosses so many areas, and we talked about it in the workplace, we talked about it in health and the health service, we could talk about it in schools. It could sit in any number of places. And I think when it was put forward in the early Keir period, and he is a little changeable at times, I think it was probably intended to put down a marker. I don't think there was ever realistically going to be that portfolio. If Aline Khan thought that there was going to be, then I think that was unfortunate, and I think her expectations were probably mismanaged. Minister of State for this is still incredibly important, and I'm sure whether it is Labour or the Conservatives, I would like to see it raise its profile. I don't think it was ever going to be a seat at the cabinet table.
Steve Reid.
Well, I mean, we weren't matching the government job for job previously, and now we were. He took a strategic decision about that, which is why that job isn't in the shadow cabinet anymore. But there is a shadow mental health minister who will be responsible for this. And actually, I think. Well,
is there? Because the rumour was that they weren't even going to have.
No, they're doing. There will be in Wes's team, in the health team, and they're doing that over tonight and tomorrow. Those jobs, I think, but. You don't judge a government on how it's done on a policy by whether it has a shadow cabinet member or a cabinet member, you judge them by their policy and what their achievements are. And I think mental health services have been the Cinderella services for far too long, actually. If you look at the police now saying they're not going to come up and clean up, try and backfill by dealing with mental health cases because they're not trained to do that. There should be mental health professionals, and there aren't, because they've all been defunded and cut and removed under the current government. I've got experience of this from my constituency as well, where just shortly after I was first elected in a by-election in 2012, a couple of parents came to see me in my constituency office because their 21-year-old son had a mental health episode, physically healthy, never had mental health before. They took him to the mental health hospital and he ended up dead because he was taken into a seclusion unit by some police officers who used force against him, took it in turns to sit on him, broke his spinal column, he went into a coma and he died. There was an inquest, but it took 7 years to get the inquest, and Theresa May, actually, as the Home Secretary at the time, was very helpful in getting that, and it laid out a load of changes that needed to happen to improve the situation for mental health patients, and I put forward a private member's bill and it went through with cross-party support. So we do need to look at how we can change things to improve mental ill health. It's been a Cinderella service for too long, but the answer to that is our policies, not the particular body sat in a shadow cabinet or a cabinet.
OK, let's move on to Stephen in East Grinstead. Stephen, hi, what would you like to ask?
Hi, good evening to you, Ian, and your guests. In a long-awaited resignation letter, Nadine Dorries MP accused the Prime Minister of running a zombie government. Since she first announced to resign, do you think Miss Dorries has been acting like the Walking Dead by ignoring her responsibilities to the constituents of Mid-Bedfordshire?
Well, in her letter, she did say that a lot of false propaganda had been put out about this, in that she was still working for her constituents. Her constituency office, her parliamentary office, was still working. I think her letter was 1,800 words long, possibly the longest resignation letter I've ever read. Richard Holden, so she accused Rishi Sunak of running a zombie government. Stephen wants to know, is she acting like the Walking Dead?
I mean, she did write an incredibly long letter. In fact, I actually stopped reading it after a while because it just seemed to be rather repetitive. But look, I mean, Nadine can do what she wanted to do. I'm glad that she has now stood down. I was campaigning in Mid-Bedfordshire yesterday, actually, on my way down from northwest Durham. Nadine clearly...
You were campaigning on a Sunday in Mid-Bedfordshire. Have you not got a life?
Oh, clearly not. I earlier in the day, in fairness, I have had quite a good weekend before that, because I've been at the Walsingham show in my constituency, where I've been out and about and looking at I had a very interesting experience looking at the dog agility trials, and on the Saturday at some of the different. There's some very nice Dexter cattle from Towlaw in my constituency, which I went to see.
Keep going, you'll be in my home village.
I know.
Anyway, back to Nadine.
I mean, I think the truth is that the Dean clearly had a very severe disagreement. And having worked with her at DCMS, we did get on a bit then. I think we've parted company on quite a few ways since that point, though.
Will you be buying her book?
I'm not planning to. No, maybe I'm sure it'll be serialised in a national newspaper, though.
Well, it's apparently been delayed due to legal issues. So, Paul Nowak.
Well, I don't think she would have wrote that letter if she would have got the seat in the House of Lords. Is the honest truth. I mean, I think a description of a zombie government and that sort of carefully worded 1,500 letter, there was very, very little I could disagree with in the letter itself. But I think there is a serious point about the fact that she has been asleep on the job for the people who live in Bedfordshire. And frankly,
careful how you phrase that.
Yeah, but frankly, she should step down when she said she was going to immediately step down. How many ever weeks it was ago. So yeah, I think she was a lot of home truths in that letter that I'd agree with, but I don't think she's necessarily the most effective political messenger at the moment.
Steve?
Well, I think there was a lot of truth in what she said. That's why it stung Rishi Sunak so badly, because they really haven't got anything to offer anymore. After 13 years with so much having gone wrong, they've completely run out of ideas. You just feel it listening to the debates in the chamber. That fizz and that buzz that I feel with my new shadow cabinet colleagues, that team there, it's just not there with the government. If what are they offering about the cost of living crisis? Nothing. They're just taxing everybody at levels. 7th highest rates of personal tax for worked for 70 years. They pass a frankly pointless piece of legislation that they pretend is going to tackle the small boats crisis. And then yesterday we had the highest number of arrivals of any day since the crisis began, showing how it isn't working. NHS, 7.5 million people on waiting lists. I could go on, and I won't, Ian, because I think you wouldn't like it. But you know, everything feels broken.
Like it.
And British people.
We've got to go to a break, and we haven't heard from Anne yet. So that was what.
British people want answers.
And another thing. Nadine Dorries had clearly moved on mentally, and she's quite angry about what happened and what she feels she was promised.
Do you think she's got justification for that?
I think she has a small amount of justification, but the real error, it seems to me, was to believe that Boris Johnson was sort of serious in backing her up.
He didn't keep a promise. There is a surprise.
He didn't keep it. I don't think we don't know whether he made that promise or not, whether she perceived it. That can happen. But what is it? Recollections may differ, as the late Queen used to say. But I do think she was probably let down, and then she's angry and she's moved on. I think she's a very talented woman. I enjoy her as a broadcaster. I don't agree with a lot of things she says, but I think her life has moved on, and perhaps it would be better to have made that move earlier. What it does look like is if the government is turning on itself, it's the flesh eating internally of the government. It's probably doing more damage even than Steve reading out lists.
Her TV show is actually rather good. I texted her to say, I've just watched your TV show, it's rather good, isn't it? And she texted back saying, are you being sarky? She said, I can never tell with you. I said, no. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't have texted you, I can assure you.
You accused Richard of not having a life before.
Fair point. Yeah. Right, we'll take more of your questions in just a moment here on LBC. It's 8:46.
LBC.
Very.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have with us Steve Reed, Richard Holden, Anne McElvoy and Paul Nowak. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from James in Ely. It looks like the government is going to make it easier for those unsightly wind farms to go up across the country. Is this a cause for celebration or disgust? Well, I think you've laid your cards on the table to which side you're on there, James. Now, the Telegraph has reported today that Rishi Sunak is going to overturn the ban on onshore wind farms, which has been in place since 2015, because of a backbench full-bench rebellion from all wings of the Conservative Party, including Liz Truss, who's not somebody I would have ever thought was a big fan of onshore wind, but there we go. Insert your own joke there if you want to. Anne McElvoy.
I understand the angle, and there is certainly something in some places a bit unsightly about this, but I think we do have to face up to the fact that our energy mix is changing very fast and that we do need to have onshore wind in there. I wonder, and I'm afraid across all the detail of this, is it really the case that you can kind of stick them anywhere? I mean, there's so many parts of the country that have other protections in place. I'm not the biggest fan myself. I come from a rural area, and in some ways, I suppose, like a lot of us, I'd rather it didn't have to change. I suppose reluctantly, I've come to the view that we need it in the energy mix, and we're probably going to have more of it.
But Richard Holden, I mean, on your drive down on a Sunday to mid-Bedfordshire doing more campaigning, you don't want to drive across the Yorkshire moors with these unsightly things polluting the environment, do you?
I think I'm touching on a good point, actually. There's protections in some areas. So part of my constituency, for example, is area of outstanding natural beauty. North Pennine Moors, do go and visit. Use the local pubs, go walking up there. And, there's rightly no wind farms in that section. Another area, there was protests when they were put up about 10, 15 years ago. Actually, people, I think, generally have pretty much got used to them now. If there was a small addition in some of those areas of the country, I don't think there'd be as much concern. I think you have to have local support for it, or at least not huge, overwhelming local objection. But I think there's parts of the country where people would be happy to have them, and particularly also offshore now. I spoke to Jacob, one of my colleagues down in Redcar the other day, and he said that he was massively opposed when they started to do the offshore wind farms you can see just off the coast at Teesside. And he said now, actually 10, 15 years on, he actually quite likes them. And I think, the thing I want to do is see as many of them made in the UK as possible, so they're sort of promoting UK manufacturing jobs for the, next generation manufacturing. So I think in the right places, and I think with actually people are much more used to them than they were. I think I've not got that much of a problem with them. I think one of the things we do have an issue with, I think in my patch, I know people are concerned about, is huge acreage used for solar farms. That's a much more contentious issue now, because you just need to cover so much of the land with them. But I think that on wind turbines, I think local people in my patch...
Because apparently the current rules say that there just needs to be one objector, and that's grounds to block a wind farm from being put up. Now that is ludicrous, isn't it? If just one person can object, because there's always one.
Indeed. I think at the time they were sprouting up everywhere when there was a moratorium on them, and people I think now they've settled in and they're part of the landscape, probably like windmills were back in, hundreds of years ago, when you got them, there was, the people wouldn't have liked them then. But I think now they've settled in. I think in certain places, if people, local communities are broadly happy with them. And I've got one in my constituency, which is actually owned by a community interest company, which is generating, I think it's tens of thousands of pounds.
One turbine?
One turbine is just generating tens of thousands of pounds a year in revenue for local charities. So I think if there's a bit of buy-in on some of this as well, I think that's also a good way of companies, working with people to actually generate.
And Steve, I mean, I don't want to bounce you on this because this comes under your portfolio, I suppose, in some ways, doesn't it?
I think it's energy, so it'd be Ed actually, on the whole, but bounce away.
Well, no, I just wondered what your instinct was on this, because if everyone agrees that we're all committed to net zero, then the logic is you would want to have more onshore wind.
Oh yeah, no, I think we should have more onshore wind, and it's not. I mean, to get to net zero is incredibly important, and we need to do that. But we've all seen what's happened across the world over the last couple of years, with Putin invading Ukraine and the supply of energy coming into the country becoming both erratic, insecure, and incredibly expensive, and the impact that's had on household energy bills. Now, one of the ways we need to protect our country from that and give people more energy security is to develop more of our own energy in the country. So I think it's incredibly irresponsible that the Conservatives banned the building of new wind energy onshore since 2015. That's 8 years. We need to be investing in more wind, wave, solar, nuclear, so that we get control of energy generation in the country.
Richard hasn't pointed out to you that we have not just the biggest offshore wind farm in Europe, we have the second biggest, the third biggest, and the fourth biggest. So you can't deny that they're committed to wind power.
Well, you've got to do all of it, though, haven't you? I think I fully support the investment in wave, but onshore wind is another part of the mix. Nuclear is another part of the mix. We haven't seen enough of that either over the last decade or so, and we need to invest in that, because if we can get control of our own energy, it's both more secure in terms of its supply, but it's cheaper, which is better for household energy bills, but it's better for British business as well.
Rishi from Longhurst says Liz Truss was one of the major suppliers of onshore wind. Paul?
I think actually Richard touched on the key point, and it's the point the government isn't doing enough on. We all agree with a balanced energy mix. We all know if you're going to get to net zero, it's onshore wind, it's offshore wind, it's solar, it's nuclear, it's hydrogen. But we've had, as you rightly said, Ian, I think after China, we've got the biggest pipeline, in inverted commas, of offshore wind projects coming anywhere in the world. And what we failed to do is to build the UK supply chains to build those turbines. Because the government, frankly, hasn't cared whether they get built here or Scandinavia or Southeast Asia. So we've got the ridiculous situation where wind farms off the coast of Scotland were importing turbines from Malaysia to be installed out off the coast of Scotland. So I'll give the government a little bit of credit. I don't normally do this. I'll give them a little bit of credit. When Kwasi was in the Department of Business, he set up a thing called the Green Jobs Task Force, Department for Education, DWP, Department for Business, unions, employers, talking about how can we make sure we're going to create and sustain the good quality green jobs of the future. That report was produced, launched with a fanfare. Precisely nothing has happened to build those UK supply chains. And we really do need to make sure we take a leaf out of Biden's book in the States, which is to say, not only are we going to invest in new green energy, we're going to make sure it's built by good unionised jobs and add value in UK supply chains. And that's been a real missed opportunity.
Right, let's squeeze in one final question. This is from Darren in Inverness. Hamza Yousaf, the Scottish First Minister, is going to announce a trial of the 4-day working week in the Scottish Civil Service. Is this the real future of work? Paul?
Well, on our 150th anniversary in 2018, the TUC said that we needed to think long and hard about what's the 21st century equivalent of a 4-day working week. So for some people, working 4 days will be appropriate. For other people, they'll want to flex their hours around childcare or other care and responsibilities. For some people, frankly, they'd want to look at their hours across their working life and say, you know what, I'd like to retire a little bit earlier rather than working through to 67, 68. I think there is a legitimate debate to have about the right balance between work and life. And frankly, if you think about the potential dividend coming down a digital dividend coming down the road through artificial intelligence, new technology, potential productivity gains, we should be thinking about how we share that digital dividend. And part of the discussion has got to be about working life. So I'm all for those sorts of experiments. I don't think 4-day working week suits everybody and every workplace, but I'm all for those sorts of experiments, thinking about what's the best way of balancing work and life.
Brief answers from the other three, please. Anne?
I'm absolutely happy to have more flexi working time and decisions. I think that's actually a very, very sensible idea. I think the missing bit here is, where does the productivity gain come from? And I don't think productivity gain comes old school by saying you've got to do the 5th day and we've got the long hours. We often have very long hours relatively in the UK. We've never really cracked the productivity puzzle. It is one of those areas. I think some of it's in plain sight, isn't it? It's raising research development. Keir Starmer says he's going to do that. Present government said, yeah, if it hangs around, it's going to do it as well. It's a bit never, and at some point you have to make that big leap. It is about education. It is also about, perhaps look at some of the strikes at the moment, about the trade unions perhaps getting a bit less stuck on old ideas about how to improve work and how to improve productivity, and working with governments of any colour. Whether it happens 4 or 5 days a week is less my concern than that.
We work with employers all the time on those issues.
Steve?
Well, I think the general point here is Britain has to compete against other countries in a world with an increasingly globalised economy, and we can't do things that will damage our productivity, because you don't want to see Britain falling back even further compared to other countries. So I think as a right that it wouldn't be right to move to this, but flexibility where it's appropriate, I think that is right. You can sometimes increase productivity by giving people greater flexibility, particularly around childcare, for instance, or care for an older parent. So well, I think as flexibility, yes. As a right, 4-day week, it wouldn't be right.
Richard?
Look, I think I think most of the panel actually probably here on this in the same place. As a right, no, but we want to see that right balance between work and also ensure that people, if they can do a few more hours, they're able to without. And that's one of the big things actually about some of the changes made to the benefit system, that you don't have those cliff edges around 16 hours and things like that. And I think anything which actually provides more flexibility for people in that, so they can do more work without losing out hugely, I think is important.
Right, final fun text question from Julia in Sefton. A campaign has started to find the famous Hofner bass guitar Paul McCartney used throughout the 60s, which went missing at the end of that decade. What bit of lost treasure have you stumbled across, whether it's something amazing or just sentimental to you? Anne?
I was going through my chest of drawers coming back from holiday and thinking, where did I put that thing that I hid when I went on holiday because I needed to get my earrings out? And there was this sort of thing, gritty thing in a piece of paper. What was that? I opened it up and it was a piece of the Berlin Wall, which I watched fall down in November 1989. And I know my piece is real because I took it down myself. And then I've always left it in the back of the drawer because talking about the asbestos risk, I'm not totally sure what's in it. But it was very nice to find it again. And I'd written in that way you do in your 20s, Berlin Wall, 1989. And I was really pleased to see it again. Then I wrapped it up again because I'm not totally sure what harm it's going to do.
It's much less lowbrow than that. I had an old box of LPs that I found in my mum's loft, and so sifting through that, everything from the first 7 Bruce Springsteen albums through till Salt and Pepper, I think, were in there, and it was a reminder of the best and worst of my teenage musical tastes.
Pepper. Well, you just guaranteed a repeat invite because Chris, my producer, big fan of Bruce Springsteen. Richard.
So my dad when I became a minister bought me it was a dish basically carved out of the cylinder head gasket of a Routemaster bus, and on top of it was welded a little dinky bus. And I lost it for months and months on end. And last weekend when I was tidying up some shelves, I found it, and I thought it was just a really nice gift that he'd specifically got for me, which was really related to my role. And anyway, I found it, and it was just a nice moment.
It's all very heartwarming, Steve.
Yeah, it's another heartwarming one, I think. We lost my dad last year, and a few months later I found a letter that he had written me a few months before that, so it felt very valuable to me.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it is an uplifting way to end the programme, actually.
It is.
But thank you all very much indeed for joining us, to Steve Reed, to Richard Holden, Anne McElvoy and Paul Nowak. We have another cross question for you coming up tomorrow at 9 o'clock as well, with another star panel. Now, in the next hour, I want to talk about plant-based diets. No, I really do, because 650 university academics have signed a letter saying that no meat should ever be served on a British university campus again. It should all be plant-based diets. I think that's ridiculous. But then again, if you want to join the fight against climate change, I suppose there is a certain logic to it. We'll get your views on this